We now turn to our featured story of the episode, our guest, Noam Chomsky. And for a biography of Noam Chomsky, we looked on Professor Chomsky's homepage at chomsky.info. Here's what we found. Noam Chomsky was born in Philadelphia on December 7th, 1928. He entered the University of Pennsylvania in 1945, where he came into contact with Zelig Harris, a prominent linguist and the founder of the first linguistics department in the United States at UPenn. In 1947, Chomsky decided to major in linguistics, and in 1949, he began his graduate studies in that field. During the years 1951 to 55, Chomsky was a junior fellow of the Harvard University Society of Fellows, where he completed his PhD dissertation. Chomsky received a faculty position at MIT in 1955, and he has been teaching there ever since. He was an early and outspoken critic of the Vietnam War. Today, he is well known for multiple activities. On the one hand, he is known by many in the political field for writing book after book, painstakingly detailing American and other atrocities overseas. From Vietnam to East Timor to Panama to Iraq, he has been a mainstay on the American political scene. He is beloved by many on the left for his prolific success waking Americans up to the negative externalities of empire building. And for the same reason, he is hated on the right with a passion which is usually reserved for minorities, flip-floppers, and people making less than $200,000 a year. In addition to this vast and impressive work as a foreign policy expert and progressive activist, Noam Chomsky is known for still something more, perhaps something that will outlive even his most memorable achievements in those fields. His ideas in the study of linguistics. His theories in this field have literally revolutionized the study and have greatly influenced several other fields as well, ranging from psychology to computer science. And here, to discuss these linguistic accomplishments, hopefully in ways we can all understand, is linguistics major and founder of UW's undergraduate linguistics club, Brad Larson. Brad, thanks for coming on to outline Chomsky's work.
Oh yeah, thanks a bunch for having me here. I hope my kind of explanation of his work here is understandable enough to everyone and kind of gets at the heart of it. Although I had prepared a little of what you've already talked about, so I'm going to have to ad-lib this a little bit here. But the main thing you've talked about got to the heart of it there with his early work in linguistics at MIT or University of Philadelphia, as well as Harvard there. His early work, particularly his 1959 critique of B.F. Skinner's verbal behavior, sparked a drastic departure from the traditional modes of linguistic inquiry and brought about this so-called cognitive revolution in social sciences and psychology and such. This kind of schism that he brought, or departure, was opposed to the traditional behavioral quasi-Pavlovian assumptions of other language theorists at the time. Chomsky instead saw language as an innate cognitive organ of the brain of sorts, unique to humans, that unfolds as a child learns their native language. And the results of this has effectively spawned the modern study of language, and he's a giant in the field today still. And even his works have impacted a lot more fields than linguistics solely. So, for example, as many disparate fields as computer science all the way to evolutionary psychology. So he has a pretty intense impact. From the way people look at the brain, who, as I said, started the cognitive revolution there, which, as opposed to how language had been studied earlier, which is more taxonomic or descriptive. He's kind of trying to explain why things the way they are, as opposed to describing how they are the way they are.
Could you compare to another field, something perhaps folks are more familiar with, who Chomsky might be compared to, great scientific minds of the past in other fields?
Well, I don't know how he would agree with this, but this is my own personal opinion here, and I can see it pretty analogous to that of Sir Isaac Newton there, because the way study of language had gone on before that was not exactly scientific, although before Newton there was, of course, scientific inquiry in the nature of physics and stuff, but he really created a giant shift and went about studying language in a really systematic, organized manner that had been done before, but not in such a way that he did it, which kind of he wanted to get inside the brain and figure out why things the way they are. So he basically went through the mouth where a lot of data comes out, which, let's see here, is a way of formalizing or making, kind of abstracting away from the rough dirtiness of actual speech. He kind of idealized language, which Isaac Newton did instead. People criticized Newton early on for his idealizations of his rules. They were saying the ball doesn't just roll down an inclined plane normally in real life. It bounces around and does all this other stuff. And people have made the same critiques of Chomsky, saying, oh, people actually talk like they stutter and start and stop like I'm doing here. But he's kind of idealizing this and hoping to formalize it in that manner, which is pretty analogous to what Newton was doing there, I guess is a roundabout way of saying it.
The New York Times Review of Books once called him arguably the most important intellectual alive. When we return, I'll be speaking with Professor Noam Chomsky about his new book, his thoughts on linguistics, and more. Stay with us. It's Don't Listen to This Show. I'm now speaking with MIT linguistics professor and U.S. foreign policy expert Noam Chomsky. Professor Chomsky, thank you very much for being with us today.
Very pleased to be with you.
I'd like to begin with your new book, Failed States, The Abuse of Power and the Assault on Democracy. In it, you claim that the American system is, quote, coming to have some of the features of failed states. What is a failed state, and what features of it is the American system coming to have?
Well, one feature of a failed state is that it is either unwilling or unable to protect its citizens from violence. Another feature is that it's what's sometimes called an outlaw state, regards itself as not constrained by international law or and international norms. Another feature is that while it may have formal democratic institutions, they don't function properly. Meaning specifically, the attitudes of the general population are remote from public policy, often sharp conflict with it. Those are the kinds of systems we call failed states. Usually we apply the term to weak states, but it's also applied to strong states, like, say, Nazi Germany or Saddam Hussein's Iraq, which is not a weak state. Unfortunately, we're coming to have those properties, strikingly, in the last few years.
When you talk about the perceptions of the public versus the actions of the government, can you be specific in what you mean there?
Yeah, well, let's take the top issue for the public, international issue, is Iraq. The attitude of the public is very clear. We ought to begin withdrawal from Iraq and have a timetable and get the troops out. The government's reaction to that was to increase the troops, surge. Okay? Sharp difference. Couldn't be sharper. Incidentally, the Iraqis overwhelmingly want the U.S. to leave either immediately or on a firm timetable, but we just disregard them. That's another property of a failed state. You carry out aggression, you don't care what the people think about it. Or take the adjacent Middle East problem, Iran, which could turn into a major war. That's very serious. Either maybe even an accidental war with the naval deployments and the provocations and so on. Well, the American people have opinions on that too. About 3/4 of them want to withdraw threats against Iran and move towards negotiations and a diplomatic settlement. And in fact, if the United States and Iran were functioning democratic societies, meaning societies in which public opinion has a significant influence on policy, then the crisis would probably be resolved. And the reason is, as we again know from very careful U.S. polls, is that Americans and Iranians have a consensus about how to solve this problem. Very close consensus. They agree very closely. So they both, with very large majorities in both countries. We're not talking about 80% level. Believe that Iran should have the right to produce nuclear energy under its, in accord with the Non-Proliferation Treaty, but should not produce nuclear weapons. Huge agreement on both sides. It goes beyond that. Both sides agree that the Middle East, the entire Middle East, should be turned into a nuclear-free zone. That means Iran, no nuclear weapons, Israel, no nuclear weapons, U.S. forces there, no nuclear weapons. Same huge majorities think nuclear weapons ought to be eliminated entirely. Well, you know, if public opinion had any influence on policy in the two countries, this problem would have a resolution.
In terms of this public perception and the public opinion on these issues, do you have confidence that a Democratic president might be able to make a difference on this?
No confidence, because the differences between the Republicans and the Democrats, while they're not non-existent, are slight. And in fact, both political parties are well to the right of the general population on a host of major issues, including these.
So do you have any ideas for the solution? I mean, one of the problems with the progressive movement in the last few years, according to some, is that the progressive youth in this country has felt disillusioned with the Democratic Party. They've been looking to other candidates, other parties like Ralph Nader, the Green Party, independent candidates, and some in the progressive community and leadership, they say it's bad, it helped elect Bush, and we're not going to achieve positive social change without uniting behind the Democrats and at least putting them in power until we can find something better, while others say, no, the Democratic Party is just part of the problem, like you were just describing. What is the solution? What should we be focusing on?
Well, you know, many times you can't get a solution if you ask the wrong question. I mean, in this case, say for the specific case of the election, say November 2004, my view was that it was important to keep Bush out, which meant that if you're in a swing state, you'd have to vote for Kerry, because anything else is a vote for Bush. In a non-swing, safe state, you do what you like, help party building or something. But I don't think that's the right question. The point is that that elections have almost ceased to have meaning in the United States, and therefore the question of which political party you choose is of secondary significance. We have to make changes here significant enough so that elections actually mean something. Now, take the last election, 2004. Most of the population did not know the stand of the candidates on issues. Okay, and there's a reason for that. The elections are run by the public relations industry, the same industry that sells toothpaste and lifestyle drugs on television, and they are not committed to providing information. In fact, their commitment is to delusion and deceit. And we all know that. We may not, face the fact, but we certainly know it. I mean, anybody who's looked at a television ad knows that its purpose is not to provide you with information about the product. And if we had a market system, that's what would happen. General Motors would put up a small notice saying, these are the characteristics of the cars we're selling next year. That's what happens in a market system. But we don't. We have a system in which business spends hundreds of millions of dollars a year to prevent markets from functioning. I mean, if you take an economics course, they'll teach you that markets are based on informed consumers making rational choices. Well, is that what television ads are about? No. They're to create uninformed consumers making irrational choices. And when the same industries want to undermine democracy, they use the same techniques they use to undermine markets. They do not present information about the candidates. They present imagery, delusion, deceit, picture of George Bush as a kind of a nice guy who you'd like to meet in a bar. Barack Obama has hope and looks you straight in the eye, and so on and so forth. Where do they stand on issues? Well, the population doesn't know because it's concealed. And there's a good reason for why it's concealed. It's because the public disagrees with them on issues. You better keep those out of the electoral campaign. And more, that's what elections are like here. Well, as long as that's true, choice of a candidate is still meaningful. Like, I think the world's much worse off with Bush than with Kerry, but it's a 10th-rate choice. We have to reconstruct a functioning democratic society, and that takes work. Not work on election day, but daily work every day. Rebuilding popular organizations, which will create a situation in which whoever the candidate is, whether it's House of Representatives or mayor or president, will simply have to accommodate him or herself to what the public wants.
You speak of delusion and deceit, and it makes me think of the current propaganda campaign from the administration using the threat of terrorism as a blanket reason for all of our endeavors overseas. And in failed states, you mentioned that Robert McNamara endorsed a judgment by Clinton Defense Secretary William Perry that there is a greater than 50% probability of a nuclear strike on U.S. targets within a decade. Conversely, some analysts believe the threats to U.S. security are being dramatically played up by the administration in an effort to perpetuate the general fear of terrorist activities as a means to generate public support for the ongoing anti-terror campaigns. And as someone sitting on the sidelines, it's often very hard to know how scared we're supposed to be. Do you find yourself more on the side of believing that the threat is real or imagined?
Well, actually, it's both, because McNamara and the Miller paper that you're referring to, I think that's the one you have in mind, they were talking about different kinds of threats. I mean, I suspect that the two of them would agree. The threat of short-term of terror that the administration is talking about, somebody, his truck bomb in New York City or something, that's probably slight. On the other, in that case, in that sense, John Mueller's is correct. The chance of somebody bringing a bomb on an airplane is probably slight. On the other hand, the chance of when U.S. intelligence, it's not just McNamara and Perry, when U.S. intelligence estimates that there's a fair chance, maybe a near certainty even, of a nuclear terror in the United States, they're referring incidentally to a dirty bomb, not a nuclear explosion, but radiation bomb. When they say that that's high, yeah, they're probably right too. The point about the administration propaganda is that it's using the threat of terror in your neighborhood to mobilize people, and at the same time it is enhancing the threat of terror. If we had another aspect of a failed state, is that its media are not really free. They are constrained. They don't. If it's a totalitarian state, they just obey state propaganda. If it's a free state, free country like ours, they adhere to it, but they don't tell you the truth. The truth is that the Bush administration is enhancing the threat of terror. So the right answer to their propaganda is not the threat of you're exaggerating the threat. It's that you're enhancing the threat. So, for example, take, say, the invasion of Iraq. It was undertaken with the expectation from intelligence agencies and others that it would increase the threat of terror. Well, in fact, it did, but far more than was expected. In fact, just a paper a month or two ago by two of the leading terrorism specialists, academic specialists, using government data, who found that the terror had gone up 7-fold since the Iraq invasion, and pretty much targeted at supporters of the invasion. Well, that's a huge increase in terror. And there are many other respects in which the administration, in fact, is increasing terror consciously, not because they want terror. They just don't care that much. And yeah, that ought to be pointed out. They're also increasing the threat of nuclear terror and nuclear proliferation. I mean, again, take the invasion of Iraq. One of Israel's leading military historians, who doesn't like Iran, you can be sure, pointed out that after the U.S. invaded Iraq, knowing it to be defenseless, if Iran is not developing nuclear weapons, they're crazy, just as a deterrent. Well, I don't know if they're doing it or not, but his reasoning is certainly understandable. And we could say the same about North Korea. Run through the history if you want, but when George Bush came in to office, North Korea had almost no nuclear weapons and missile capacity, virtually none, and what there was being monitored and reduced. After 6 years of Bush, they have 8 to 10 nuclear weapons and long-range missiles. Why is that? A direct reaction to the Bush policies of provocation, which led directly to the expected reaction of North Korea arming itself. And we can go on and on like this. So yeah, there's a problem about Bush's efforts to mobilize the population for terror, the fear of terror, take off your shoes when you go into an airplane and so on. That's population control. On the other hand, the correct answer to that is not the threat of terror is less than we think. It's that they're increasing the threat, and we should be doing something about that.
I'd like to switch gears just for a moment to speak with what some people have called the other Noam Chomsky, which is the professor of linguistics at MIT. This question actually was submitted by Brad Larson, who's the founder of the University of Washington Undergraduate Linguistics Club. He has pointed out that you have used examples from the histories of established hard sciences like physics and chemistry to elucidate your methodology in linguistics. For a sense of context, is it possible for you to say where you think the current state of linguistic research sophistication might be in terms of the history of physics? That is, for example, is it analogous to early or late Newtonian physics in its sophistication, more advanced, less advanced, or is it impossible to tell?
Well, first of all, I'd just say that I don't particularly have any methodology, just normal scientific method, which is not taught. It's hard to judge. I mean, physics is my own view, which I've expressed a few times, is that linguistics is basically pre-Galilean. That is, it's sort of building up knowledge and understanding with the hope that it will undergo something like a Galilean revolution. But I'd say that about most fields. Physics is extremely unusual. Physics has made extraordinary progress, tremendous depth. But part of the reason for that, as any physicist will tell you, is that physics narrows its scope to simple questions. So if a molecule becomes too complicated to understand, physicists hand it over to chemists. And if it becomes too complicated for chemists to understand, they hand it over to biologists. And if some structure, organic structure, becomes too complicated for them to deal with, they hand it over to social scientists. And finally, maybe to historians. As you get greater and greater complexity, the capacity to deal with the questions in any depth, of course, reduces. Now, linguistics is sort of off on the side in this respect. It's a core property of the most complex object we know in the universe, namely the human brain. But it is a core property of that, but it happens, luckily for linguists, it happens that it's relatively isolable. That is, you can identify the properties of human competence and behavior that are linguistics, and you can pretty much separate them from the total complexity for special study. Now, of course, whenever you abstract something, you're losing something or other. That's also true in physics or anything. But that's the way science proceeds, rational inquiry proceeds. You see if there's something that can be abstracted for special study without losing too much. And in the case of language, that appears to be possible. So there are results of, there's a level of explanation that's beyond what you usually find in the study of complex systems. Again, because you can isolate it and simplify it.
Trying now to see if we can't connect the two strands of your work. I saw a speech last year that you made at West Point, in which you referred to research being done in the area of universal morality. The idea is similar to your ideas on universal grammar, that humans may in fact possess some kind of innate moral precepts that are universal in nature and may actually be rooted in human anatomy. Could you elaborate on that bit in particular, and what kind of research results are coming out of this area of study?
Well, actually, a lot of this goes back to an observation by David Hume back in the mid-18th century. He pointed out that we make moral judgments in a fairly consistent way in entirely new situations, and we seem to do that without any limit. We're constantly facing new situations. We make moral judgments. We make them pretty well the same way others do. And he said this is only possible if there are some principles which are part of our nature from which these moral judgments are derived. He called these instincts, not what he called our original instincts, those that we share with other animals, like wanting food and so on, but some special instinct, a kind of a moral instinct, if you like, that's part of our nature, which must involve some principles. Well, this is a history that proceeds with this, through the major philosophers. It was picked up in modern times by John Rawls, the leading political philosopher, American political philosopher of the last century. He modeled himself very explicitly on linguistic grammars, those of the 1960s. That's when he was writing. Actually, we were friends. And tried to ask what a moral grammar would be for the concept of justice, which is his interest. That was not his main point. It's just an analogy that he picked up, and it's the correct analogy, I think. Well, in the last few years, there are people who've been taking up that idea much more systematically. One of them was a graduate student here, John Mikhail, has a number of papers and a book coming out of it, now teaches at Georgetown Law School. Another is Mark Hauser, professor of cognitive science and primatology at Harvard, who's been doing interesting studies. He also has a book that just came out called Moral Minds on how human beings and using whatever comparative analysis there is, but how human beings do in fact make judgments in rather complex moral situations. A lot of this is based on work done by moral philosophers in the last 20, 30 years who have done thought experiments. They've asked, how would you respond to the following kind of situation? And the results are pretty surprising. Like people make different judgments, even if the outcomes of the actions are the same. Like if you're carrying out an action which will lead to the death of a person and save 5 people, under certain circumstances, people will agree to do it. Under other circumstances, they won't agree to do it. And now there's experimental work on this, started by Mikhail, carried out by Hauser, now a lot of others. And it's with children, it's cross-culturally, you get pretty constant results, and some of the principles are emerging. Now, this is not, notice that this is not going to tell you what it's right to do. That's a different question. This is going to tell you what our moral nature is to the extent that you can carry it out. And that's a prerequisite to asking any further questions. So that's, it tends, it aims towards a moral grammar, which would account for moral judgments the same way, maybe, or in a parallel way, to the way in which a linguistic grammar tries to account for the interpretation of the expressions that you and I are now using.
We have run very low on time, Professor Chomsky. My final question for you is that in the next couple of weeks, we expect to interview the new director of the Peace Corps on this program. I haven't had a chance to do a lot of research on the topics we'd like to cover, but I was wondering from your experience in researching U.S. foreign policy, if you have come across any information that might prompt an interesting question for that conversation and what that question might be.
Well, my impression impression of, in general, my attitude toward the Peace Corps is pretty positive. But I should say my general impression over the years is that the Peace Corps has been more helpful to the United States than it has been to the countries where the Peace Corps operated. Now, it may have done good things in those countries, like, if Peace Corps volunteers help build, say, wells in a place in Africa where people don't have access to water, or start a school somewhere in South Asia or whatever it may be. That's good. That can help people. But the main effect that has been important is that these people who go somewhere else learn about what the world is like. They see that the world is not the way it is, the way we're trained to think about it. They gain an understanding of the perspective of people who are at the wrong end of the guns. And that's very valuable. And a lot of them have come back and done very constructive work here, helping Americans understand that our view of the world is extremely warped. I mean, we're viewing the world from the point of view of extreme privilege and power, from the point of view of those who hold the clubs, not the ones who are beaten by the clubs. And that's always a dangerous stand to take. And to the extent that the Peace Corps carries out that educational purpose, it's of great value, quite independently of what help it may give to the people who it's working with.
Noam Chomsky, it has been a privilege and a pleasure speaking with you. Thank you very much for your time today.
Good to talk to you.